Hello, thank you for joining us during our noon hour for Arts and Agency Week with Erie Arts and Culture. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first annual Arts and Agency Week, a virtual event designed to explore the ways the arts are being leveraged to raise awareness of systemic issues, amplifying underrepresented voices, and generate creative solutions to societal challenges. Funding for Arts and Agency Week was provided in part by the Erie Community Foundation through their Shaping Tomorrow grant program. My name is Leslie C. Sotomayor, and I am the president of the Chroma Guild. The Chroma Guild's mission is to advance opportunities and access to resources for creative and cultural professionals of color in northwestern Pennsylvania. The regional network builds both individual and organizational capacity by expanding equity and inclusion within the area's cultural and creative sector. Erie Arts and Culture defines a creative and cultural professional as any person involved in the conception, production, distribution, promotion, interpretation, or conservation of creative and cultural objects, programs, and events. Through this network, Erie Arts and Culture aims to connect and empower artists, curators, critics, producers, venue owners, promoters, and archivists who value culture and creativity in all of its forms. You must be 18 and over, and today I have the privilege of introducing Seitu Jones. Seitu Ken Jones is a multidisciplinary artist, advocate, and maker based in St. Paul, Minnesota. Working between the arts and public spheres, Jones channels the spirit of radical social movements into experiences that foster critical conversations and nurture more just and vibrant communities from the soil up. He is recognized as a dynamic collaborator and a creative force for civic engagement. This presentation is live streamed through Zoom, as well as Erie Arts and Culture's Facebook page and YouTube channel. The session will conclude with a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free, and we invite you to type them into the Q&A box. And at the end of the presentation, we will read the questions to Seitu for answering and conversation. So with no further ado, I would like to turn it over to Seitu Jones. Thank you so much for being.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for that great introduction. A big thanks also to Erie Arts and Culture. And I should also give a shout out to Leslie's daughter there.
You could hear her a little, huh?
Oh, well, yeah. No, it's great. It's great to do that. I'm right now in the office of my archives, where we're gathering a bunch of things, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And that's about a mile away from my home and studio. Generally, my wife interrupts whatever Zoom thing I have using our ghetto intercom where she yells, "I say two!" So that's all right. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to share with you some slides, talk about my work, and then, as Leslie just described, end with questions from you all. And I am going to go to those slides right now. And let's see here. And so these are images of my work, and the images of my work are really to give me street cred as an artist more than anything, to show you my large-scale public artworks, to show you the works where I attempt to blend art and nature, and then to end up on what is on everybody's minds, if not on their TV and flat screens and whatever screens right now as we speak. And that's where I'm going to conclude. So this work is in the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden, part of Walker Arts Center near downtown Minneapolis. And the work I'm referring to is that shadow that is in the pavement, embedded into the pavement, cast in bronze, are a set of poems in these 7 sculptures that you experience as a surprise as you walk through the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden. This is a collaboration between one of my longtime friends and fellow artists, Tecumseh Aiken, who's based here in the Twin Cities, and my wife, who is a poet. We've come the last 30 years, the 3 of us, to create works. And right now I'm working with my wife on another large commission for the University of Minnesota. But this piece, along with a few others, are dedicated to the presence of African-American women in the history of Minnesota. This poem here is dedicated to Harriet Scott. Harriet Scott was the wife of Dred Scott, who sued for their freedom, claiming because they had lived in free territory and their free territory was Minnesota, that they therefore were free. But the Supreme Court came out with one of his most infamous judgments in 1857, saying that Black folks not only had no rights to sue, but had no rights as citizens. And the thing that really prompted them was the birth, or really prompted Harriet Scott to nudge Dred Scott to sue, to go through this process. But the thing that really got her was her daughters, the thought of her daughters growing up enslaved. And so my wife created this poem, Selena Guyton created this poem, where all the words in the first, all the letters in the first lines, or the lines of this poem, ended up becoming daughters. She created another poem about another woman who was enslaved in early Minnesota history. Also recognizing that this is Dakota land that we are on. We created one sculpture that is only activated when it's raining or when it's wet. And this was dedicated to a fellow artist and poet who had lost his life in an automobile accident, Kirk Washington. So working in a variety of mediums and blending art and nature in different ways, and really being inspired or using collard greens as a metaphor, as a tool to probe Southern cuisine and African-American cuisine, and then African-American culture. In particular, I have used the collard green theme over and over in installations. That first installation was at Project Row House in Houston, Texas. This installation is inside the Bates College Museum in Lewiston, Maine. This is inside the Urban Institute for Contemporary Arts in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So over and over again, I will use this as a theme in my work. In fact, the chair that's suspended is like right behind me here. This was an installation of turnip greens in Nashville, Tennessee, for the Nashville Farmers Market that's suspended 15 feet over people's heads in the big shed and food court inside the farmers market. Also blending art and nature, and really being informed by food security issues, I worked with 3 other artists to help found Frogtown Farm, a 5-acre farm in the middle of a new 12-acre park in St. Paul, in my neighborhood, just like less than a half a mile down the street. In fact, I walked by it yesterday. I walked by it today. This is an aerial view. And here you can see the farm and it's 3.5 productive acres, and we use it as a real deal production farm. And here you can see no straight rows. You can see how it's framed through artist's eyes as we sculpted the landscape to create this piece. In the past, we have produced over 10,000 to 12,000 pounds of fruits and vegetables, of produce that has been distributed in our neighborhood, 85% of that staying right within our neighborhood, using permaculture techniques to raise these perennial fruits and vegetables. And one of the things that led up to this was create the community meal, a meal for 2,000 people at a table a half a mile long at one of the streets that borders Frogtown Farm. This was a step towards creating this farm. And this was also a way for me to work to introduce healthy foods and healthy eating to my neighbors. So what led me to this was in my studio, and we live in this renovated storefront. We live upstairs and have studio space downstairs. When I would open my windows, my storefront windows, my studio windows when I'm downstairs working, I would see this constant parade of people walking by my studio windows in one direction and coming back just a few minutes later with bags of groceries, knowing that they had just shopped in the local convenience store a block away. And looking a little bit further, a little bit deeper into those bags, you would see boxes of processed foods, barely any fruits and vegetables. At that time, the convenience store wasn't selling that many. And so for 2 years, I had worked to organize, working with the local arts organization, Public Arts St. Paul, to create this public art endeavor, or this public art event, where we work with local farmers, and over this 2-year period preceding the meal, had gone into people's homes. We had even got a little grant to give neighbors money to sponsor a meal, to invite their neighbors in close proximity to them to come and share a meal. The only thing that we asked was that it be a healthy meal, however folks define that. And that helped determine the menu for a meal. We work with farmers, local farmers, to provide the meals. And for me, the scale was really out there. I mean, Brother Perez provided almost 400 pounds of black beans. This sister, Jackie Miller, provided about 300 pounds of collard greens, along with several other farmers. Now, where all this began, it began with my grandmother. And this is my grandmother in her garden. And you can see just barely behind her, she is standing in front of a plot where she turned over the earth, and standing in front in the springtime in one of the plum trees that she had in her backyard as well. And this backyard is about a half a mile from where I am right now. And this is me in that same backyard. So I grew up with this woman who, believe it or not, was the daughter of a man who had been enslaved, and had worked as a porter in Red Wing, Minnesota, and a hotel porter, and earned enough there to begin a farm in Rochester, Minnesota, where my grandmother was born and grew up. So I was in contact with this woman who had grown up on a farm in Minnesota with this man, as I said, who had been enslaved. He was a Civil War veteran. Now, this is not my grandmother, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, but he is the grandfather of botany as we know it in the extension system as we know it in the United States. This is an early portrait of George Washington Carver. Now, I show you my grandmother's garden because one of her daughters, one of my aunties, would call me Little George Washington Carver. And I would just bristle whenever she called me George Washington Carver. And I was about 6 years old, but still, I knew at that age who George Washington Carver was because he was such an icon. We know about his work with Peanuts, but she knew about my interest in art and my interest in nature. And so why call me Little George Washington Carver? I mean, I would think to myself, like, why would it, this is what I thought as a kid, is like, why would I want to be like that old bald-headed man? And here I am, that old bald-headed man. But what my Aunt Beverly knew, and let me talk a little bit about George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver, as I said, created this extension program, developed it, and expanded it, and many land-grant institutions across the country used a lot of his methods in bringing these new research, new ideas, new strains of crops and varieties and techniques to farmers. And he was committed to bringing that. He and Booker T. Washington, who created the Tuskegee Institute, were committed to bringing that to farmers. This is the first Jessup wagon. We saw an incarnation of it later on, and there were several different Jessup wagons. They were called the Jessup wagons because philanthropic, I can't even say it, a rich guy in New York made this big contribution to the Tuskegee Institute to allow this to happen. And this was the first version of the Jessup wagon. Now, this is an illustration, the concept of that wagon. You can see how similar it was. This was drawn by George Washington Carver. What my auntie knew is that George Washington Carver was a painter. And he was a painter before he was a painter before he was a botanist. In fact, he first went to college studying art. And while at Simpson College in Iowa, an artist, one of his instructors saw his work and saw that he painted nothing but plants and said to him that you should study botany. And the rest is history. Now, with all of his scientific work, with all of his research regarding plants, regarding blending nature and art, he never stopped painting. He never stopped becoming an artist. And in fact, he gained notoriety as an artist long before his notoriety and fame came as a botanist. This particular painting, now this is a painting of him as an older man, But he painted this portrait of the yucca plants in the late 1880s, early 1890s. And this piece was submitted to one of the art competitions for the Chicago Exposition of 1893, and it won an award. A lot of his work was lost in a fire at the Tuskegee Institute and the Carver Museum after his death. But his work keeps showing up. He gave a lot of his work away. He did a number of sketches, but you can see his work popping up in different ways. And so this is some of his work. Some of it is real rough and raw, but he never stopped exhibiting his work. Now, I'm going to show you a little clip from a film that was created by an African-American dentist based in Michigan, but he wanted to go back to Tuskegee, Alabama, to the Tuskegee Institute, and document George Washington Carver. And so this is part of a longer film, but this is the first few scenes. It lasts less than a minute. But I want you to check out George Washington Carver. And with all the work he had done with botany, check out the first thing that he does here. You know, he was a master textile artist as well. Now, his knitting, a lot of it has been preserved, and that's something else he gave away. His knitting was a little bit rough, but I'm going to show you some more of his textile work. That blew me away. And this is probably the piece that he was knitting. Now, he learned the textile arts, what he called at that time the womanly arts, but I really define it as one of the farm arts. He learned this from the family that he lived with, that after slavery, after emancipation, that had owned his family before that. But the thing that blows me away is his stitching and crocheting and creating doilies. This lace just kind of blows you away. And he used his scientific mind, or that part of his scientific mind that used math and signs and symbols to create these intricate patterns in his work. So needless to say, his work still inspires me. But the thing that really kind of blew me away, with all of the work that he had done, with all the hundreds of uses of peanuts and sweet potatoes that he had discovered or invented, he created a set of stains from sweet potatoes and from the soil. Over 73 different stains that we can attribute to him right now, and colors. He was really thinking about many of the farmers that he had worked with. He and Booker T. Washington both wanted a way to really improve life and lifestyles of all of these poor farmers in the rural South. This is a display from the Carver Museum at the Tuskegee Institute, showing some of the paint charts that he created, the paint samples he created. The thing that really blew me away was that he, one of the few inventions that he patented he only patented a few of these things because he wanted these things to be shared with the world, was the color blue. And the color he recreated, and he called it Egyptian blue. This blue that you see here is one of the first synthetic colors created by humans. And when I say synthetic, it was still using natural materials, but using the breaking down the chemical components in soils to create this particular color here. And I could spend more time talking about this Egyptian blue, but this is a sample of the Egyptian blue that was created, or that George Washington Carver created. And that color blue, the process of creating that color was lost to human memory. And every now and then it would come back. It came back during the Italian Renaissance and disappeared again. And George Washington Carver in the 1920s brought it back for all of us. This is an installation by the late Terry Adkins, a multidisciplinary artist. And this is in 2014, shortly before he passed on, where he was granted the use of this color blue in his work. You know, a detail of that, making all of these references to plants. And when I say granted this, he was granted this at University of Iowa that has a lot of George Washington Carver's archives. Another artist, this is work by Jason Moran, another multidisciplinary African-American artist. You might know his work as a musician, but he's also a visual artist. And here again, he used the color blue, actually uses Egyptian blue, making references to George Washington Carver. Now, this is where I end. I've got a few more slides to go here. Right now, as we speak, if you were to switch to another channel, you would see the trial of Derek Chauvin, the man who murdered George Floyd. And this is part of this attempt to reshape a place. So neighbors, artists, community folks came together to reshape and recreate what folks are calling George Floyd Square. So traffic has been prevented from going through this intersection where George Floyd was murdered for the last 10 months. And shortly after the murder of George Floyd, when folks were up and in the streets during the rebellions, when people, business owners covered their windows in Minneapolis and in St. Paul with plywood, I, like many other artists, wanted a way to remember George Floyd, a way to treat and recreate and integrate artwork into this new plywood, or these many new plywood avenues that were created. I created a stencil that is on my website. So if you go to the hashtag Blues for George, and that's the numeral 4, you'll see a stencil there available on my website that you can download and to recreate this portrait to remember George Floyd. So in addition to that portrait, just recently, within the last few weeks, and then just this past Sunday, I, along with 2 other artists, were commissioned to create these works for billboards above George Floyd Square. And this was taken just last week when these billboards went up. And here I used George Washington Carver's blue. So that dark blue and all the blues in that portrait are tints of that George Washington Carver blue. So in a sense, this is a blues for two Georges. But more than that, I mean, after this great reception that we had out in the middle of George Floyd Square on Sunday, we left there at 1:00, and less than an hour after we left that site, 10 miles away, another young Black man was murdered by the police. And so these are the last slides here. As a part of the rebellion and turmoil that hit the streets after the murder of George Floyd, and that is happening right now, that happened right after the murder of Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center, not too far from here, was this unfortunate destruction. This image that you see here is the Hiawatha Post Office in South Minneapolis, almost across the street from the 3rd precinct that was burned. And notice those trees were planted by neighbors years ago as an orchard. And even with the destruction in the background, those trees still bore fruit. This is my hand here holding one of the pears from that. And this is where I'm going to close, to really talk about, as a sign of our resiliency. I ended up baking those plums that I harvested into a tart, showing the power of transformation. It can happen in a kitchen. It can happen on the streets. The power of transformation as we shape place and site. And so the thing that I ask you all here is to continue this transformation. Work there in Erie and beyond in transforming and changing the streetscapes to make them more kind to humans, to make them more equitable, to make them more fair. So with that, I thank you all.
Wow, Seitu. Phenomenal. Thank you so much for taking us on that journey. And there's so many intersections to historical context, maternal lineage.
That's right.
And the impact that those experiences leave on you psychologically, emotionally,
right,
and in your work, right? And so there are so many things that you touched on that I feel are such poignant points. Kind of going to the beginning of your presentation when you were sharing the shadow work on the sidewalks, and in conjunction with words and poetry, and this ode to those who have come before us, I thought was a great thread throughout your presentation for working the land as farmers and the agriculture component of that, but also the threading with Carver's knitting and lace and painting. And so I thought maybe we could start by initiating the conversation and hopefully inviting those who are watching to please use the Q&A chat box to drop in comments, reflections, and questions. But thinking about those threads and community work and community activation, because you have shared with us really different modes of what community activation and engagement can look like through embodiment as artists, through your experiences. So I'm wondering if maybe we can talk a little bit more about the component of community engagement. How do people receive? How do they react? How do they reflect when they engage with these different types and modes of, whether that's eating together or sharing, in the produce that is reaped from harvest, or coming together to remember George Floyd and having that cultural memory activated in that way. If you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. Every piece every work of public art has some community engagement component that becomes a part of it. I've been fortunate to be the artist on many design teams, urban design, kind of sometimes building or multi-use developments, but primarily in infrastructure projects. And with those projects, there are a set, many times it's mandated to have community meetings as a part of it. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. That's sometimes very formal, and it's even become more formal now that we have to do it via Zoom. And so that's one component. The other thing that I have done is work with folks, work with a community of folks in some way or another, like for the shadow pieces. Mm-hmm. My collaborator, Takumba, and I spent time in the Minneapolis sculpture garden tracing people's shadows. Mm-hmm. Both folks that were visitors, staff people to the Walker Art Center. And with work that we did for the city of Minneapolis, those shadows as well. And we did that at particular times of the year. So we trace shadows at the autumn and the spring equinox. We trace shadows on the days of the summer and winter solstice, so that those folks' shadows would be lined up to these celestial events, and so that people could stand in the shadows of these folks who came before. So, I mean, that's another kind of involvement. Now, even a third is to have folks actually help me in the artistic process. Right. And then another, like for the community meal, is to sometimes do these evaluations, and this is many times demanded by funders to kind of gauge what people got out of these events. I mean, one of the interesting things is we expected folks to, and I set out wanting folks to understand this healthy meal, to meet farmers, to meet the farmers that grew the food, to meet the folks that produce the food. Mm-hmm. I mean, that cooked the food as well, too, or prepared the meal, and the folks that served it, to really have this over-the-table conversation about food justice, about food policy. Well, even with all of that, one of the things that folks remember, and every now and then I'll still run into folks, some of my neighbors, oh yeah, you the guy there. And the thing that I never expected was, several different times people said to me, you're the guy that closed the street. And just the act of doing that and having that rest in community's hands is a step toward empowering folks. And I never realized that would be one of the things that came out of it. And so for every one of these projects that I'm involved with, there are different outcomes. And so it's this dance back and forth with all of these different things that are these signs of engagement. And with the last pieces that I showed you, in particular, the pieces around George Floyd Square, I mean, it's not just integrating art into this social movement, but it's to remind folks that really that this artwork is there to push, promote, advocate for systematic change. That this work is there to remind folks that we need to change the whole idea of what public safety is. And so so that's a long answer, but it's hard to give you one concise answer to that.
Well, but I think that there lies the importance, is how these things are entangled, right? And how
exactly.
Right, that's what community means, is this entanglement of our individual lives as collective, which become collective stories. And when we realize that we're all interconnected, whether by choice or not, right, we hope that that's one way to transform the conversations through public art. I think
Absolutely.
That's one of the things that I'm taking away from your sharing. And so I'm going to go to
one other point there too.
Go ahead.
Is on that point before we go on, is that please steal these ideas. These ideas are mine, but I stole them from somewhere as well too. I mean, I didn't invent the wheel. George Washington Carver was a real deal inventor. So please steal these ideas, share these ideas. If you have any questions, comments, or want any more details, check me out. Track me down via my website.
I think that's a really important sentiment to put out there, because I was thinking as you were connecting yourself because of your mother and grandmother, right? As you were connecting yourself, and you were connected from an early age to Carver,
right?
I think that speaks to the importance of why we need to know our histories, why we need to know those that came before us, which is what your work seems to point to, because those residues stay with us, and we can only hope that that soil be fertilized,
right,
for such conversations and acts. So it's really, I never knew the history of Egyptian blue until today. Thank you. I use blue a lot in my work. I'm an artist as well. And so I use blue a lot in my work. And now to have a deeper understanding of this hue of blue that exists and the history behind it gives my work now more meaning because of that. So thank you so much for that. So I wanted to go to the Q&A box, and there's a question. How does an artist remain true to its soul and values and still conform to a commissioned work or work on demand as others would want it? Have there been times when you wanted to do more but felt restricted?
Absolutely. I mean, even with this billboard design, you're limited to this particular rectangle. There's always this tension that exists. And one of the challenges is for you to be able to maintain your integrity as we go back and forth in a conversation in a collaboration, and you want to make sure that it becomes remains a collaboration and not a collaboration along the way. So it does mean that you do give up something for this work that appears in public. The unfortunate reality for any artist that works in the public sphere is that there is this overriding emphasis on work that can be maintained, and you have these liability issues. And so that is also a component in designing and creating work in the public realm or on the streetscape. So there's always this back and forth on it. Now, one of the things that I do is still maintain an active studio practice. So that work that I create in the studio is completely mine. There's no ifs, ands, buts about it. There's nothing going back, no tension in the work at all, except the tension that I may use in presenting work in a particular that has a particular philosophic base to it. And so there's always a challenge that is, and the big thing is like presenting work that is where you maintain your integrity.
Maintaining integrity.
Yeah. And that is, and the older I get, the less I care about what other folks feel. And, as somebody that creates this work in community, creates this work in the public, I do it for these altruistic reasons, but there's no artist that won't tell you that it really is, or it may or may not admit that it's really about me as well too. There's, the work that I put out on the street comes from my head. And so, yeah, it really is presenting your vision of the world.
So I have two questions to follow up with. And the first one is going to be kind of broader. I'm thinking about Chroma Guild here in Erie, and how we are trying to build community to support each other, and how to engage with social issues that come up in our community. And so what are some of the things that you could advise? And I think that your presentation begins to definitely give us some places to start to think about how to raise public awareness of the artists, the regional artists, talents, and value in our community. How can we more effectively maybe do that, or more intentionally, maybe is a better word?
I think you all have got a really good start already. I mean, the thing that right before this event went live, we were talking about the new program that you all have there, the new Artist in Residence program. And that is one of the ways that you can at least begin to shape not just the streetscape, but shape the policy regarding the streetscape. We're fortunate here in the city of St. Paul to have this agency, and they were my partner, Public Arts St. Paul, in create the community meal, that long meal. But they have been my partner on a variety of other things. They sponsor the City of St. Paul's Artist in Residence program, or called the City Artists. One of the things that they spearheaded was creating a public art ordinance, so that every design project has to have an artist that's built into the team. So artists are embedded in the planning process.
What a fantastic idea. Okay.
So that's one thing to do. And you all have already begun to do that by placing these artists. I was the first artist in residence for the city of Minneapolis. And there I worked with the development agency, Community Planning and Economic Development, CPED. I was embedded in CPED, and I served as the artist for transit corridors, integrating or sometimes sneaking art into the design processes, sidewalk stamping, lighting design, bridge railings. There were all these things that we placed art inside of these processes. And that's one of the things on the municipal side that I would really encourage you all to create. So think about the program that you all have created as the foot in the door. And once that happens, really open up that, kick the door open, and then bound in there and let folks know that you all are here.
Right. Absolutely. Love that. So the next question is from Matthew. It says, thank you so much for your inspiring talk during this difficult time for our community and nation as a whole. Urban farming has come to Erie fairly recently. What advice do you have to a community that's just getting this kind of work off the ground? So it kind of goes along with what you were just explaining, but does anything else come to mind?
Yeah, there again, as I showed with George Washington Carver, blend art and nature, integrate artists into the farming and gardening practices there. You'd be surprised how many artists will pop out of the farmer's shell or that will blend the art and shell. I could go with example after example after example of farmers, African-American farmers in particular, who are also artists, who have used art, whether that's song, whether that's visual arts, whether that's literary art, in their work in some way. So you can use this as an opportunity to rethink the way that you farm. So that's one thing. The other thing is to make sure that whatever you all do will affect policy. We have been successful sometimes in integrating some of the policies. In particular, one of the things that we've advocated is that food is a natural right. And the city of Erie, the city of St. Paul, should have that as a value. If the city doesn't, then the community definitely should. Now, as you get off the ground, you're going to find all kind of crazy ordinances that will slow your process down, and you're just going to have to work around that. I mean, for example, here in the city of St. Paul, believe it or not, bees are considered livestock. I mean, that is part of the policy. So if you want to have a beehive, you have to apply for a permit, and then it has to have some sort of barrier around it. And that has to be at least 6 feet away from your neighbor. And like composting. Right. Legally, here in the county, you can't compost your neighbor's stuff. So you got food waste. You can't put it on a pile between houses. It has to be on your property. I mean, so there are all these different, and I could go on and on, all these things that need to be changed. And so that will be part of your challenge, not just planting, not just gaining permission and of control of a site. I mean, that's part of it too. I mean, we can go on and on about that, but like all these other little things that will hop in right in front of you.
So it sounds like the vocabulary and language around this within this conversation is just as equally important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's important to have a poet around. We need to, and on that point, Leslie, we should take advantage of artists and coming up with these new terms.
Absolutely.
Coming up with the names of stuff. I hate using the tired term of placemaking, and for a variety of reasons. I don't want to go too deep into that.
Well, that was another question about place and site.
Right.
that was going to follow. And I was specifically thinking about place and site with your use of furniture. Like what you have behind you.
Yeah,
what was your thinking with using these pieces of furniture, wall coverings? One of the slides you showed the furniture in a room that it looked like wallpaper, but I don't know if that was just painted a mural in that room completely. But that as a place and site location with your work in a domesticated way, which reminds me of what you talked about with Carver and his, what did he call women's work or women's art?
Womanly arts.
Yeah. So this domestication of the arts and which talks about then private and public placing and location. So what are some of the thoughts around the furniture and the private spaces that you create?
Yeah, let me answer that, but first let me just carry on just a little bit about.
Sure, go ahead.
These terms that we use are terms that are seasonal, that are transitory, that won't be here for a while. I mean, we're using that right now just because we don't have a term in the English language that really defines what you all are doing in Erie and what I'm attempting to do here. I mean, that's why we need poets to come up with another term to use on creating space. Now, behind me, let me tell you the truth about these pieces behind me. I have this old raggedy truck, and as I drive around, I will spy a piece that somebody placed on the boulevard, and I will pick that up and put that in the back of my truck. So I end up driving down the street looking like Fred Sanford. And for those of y'all that don't know, I mean, that is something also that is very cultural.
Very much,
specific. Because there are a lot of folks that don't know who Fred Sanford was, Sanford and Son. So I advise you to go back and check out this classic story of a classic old sitcom of this African-American man who collected junk. So I'll drive down the street with collecting this stuff, and we'll place it in my garage for a while, make sure that there's no bugs in it, spray it down, and then bring it in and use these pieces in installations in some way. So it's a way of repurposing things. So like all of this work behind, well, not all of it, but like this piece, and this piece were all salvaged from the street. And sometimes will go back on the street. So it's a way of like creating these signs and symbols and integrating my work back out there some kind of way.
So I'm by this point, I'm guessing that if anyone were to see one of these pieces out somewhere on the boulevard, they'd be like, there was Seitu. Right?
Yeah, sometimes, and if we would have had more time, I would have gone over all of these folks that infected me, informed me, and inspired me in some way. And one of them was this artist that we would now call a naive, but his name was Maurice Carlton. And Maurice would dig through, and this, as I was coming up as a teenager, I saw his work on the streetscape, placed on the street, actually even right outside these doors here. Maurice's work would pop up. He would go through the riches of dumpsters and trash cans, pulling out this work and repurposing it, painting, making these construction, these assemblages of all of this work. And so Maurice inspired me, and I'm not the first person here in St. Paul to do it. In addition, Maurice created the first community garden that I knew of.
Oh, wow.
So like all of this work comes from someplace else. As I said, I've been inspired, informed, and stole these ideas from the best folks around.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And I feel that is what education can do. And these informal spaces for education, right? Serve as catalysts for these things, as vessels for us to create through and on. So I thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us a little glimpse into your process and a little bit of your history and how you are activating these public spaces in wonderful ways. I would love to, before we wrap up, touch on the work that you're doing of archiving.
Oh, yeah.
Especially as I'm seeing a massive file cabinet behind you on one side. So maybe with what you're currently doing with the archiving and your foundation, and maybe we could wrap up with that.
Yeah, I right now am working on the next season of my life and trying to create a template for other artists, for African-American artists and other artists of color in particular, to build their legacies on. And so right now I am speaking to you from this small office space that we're renting temporarily until we open up a new studio space. So I'm working with an African-American architect and an African-American contractor in creating a new studio space on a vacant lot that my wife and I own about 2 blocks away from where we are. That'll have 2 apartments on top of it, plus a small library archive. I want to prevent the erasure of my legacy.
Yeah.
All too often, artists of color's legacy is forgotten or lost. Okay. I've seen too many artists come up who are my peers or a little bit before me, like Maurice Carlton, who I just say, whose work is lost to time, whose memories are erased. And these traditions, what came before, needs to be passed on in both formal and informal ways. And this is my attempt to do that. So we have moved, and what you don't see here, I mean, everything looks nice and pretty on this side of the camera, but what you don't see are the piles of boxes that contain sketchbooks, old drawings, I mean, all kind of stuff that's on the other side of the camera. But it was also a way to clean out my studio. It was also a way to let my children know too about, and to set up a real formal transition process. I hope to be able to work in this new studio for the next 10, 20 years after it's completed. But after I pass on, it will become a residency program, in particular for artists that have a strong community engagement component in their work. And this is a template. This can be a template for other artists.
Absolutely. And so as you're explaining that and sharing that, I'm thinking about how that's another way of building up our communities and our communities
Absolutely.
of color specifically, right? How
Absolutely.
We can support each other as curators, educators, and artists and activists of color by, one of the things that you started that sentence with sharing about your legacy is how you are in collaboration and intentionally working with other artists of color.
Right.
In bringing your dream for your legacy into fruition. So I think that is another way that, maybe we don't talk about it enough. How we need to build within our communities a support system where we are seeking intentionally each other out in building these communities that we want, that we have not had for ourselves.
That's
and
right.
The histories that we haven't had for ourselves to resist and challenge the erasure that you're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We could go on and on talking about the disparities between communities of color and the larger white community that exists. One of the things that exists is the ability to pass on wealth. And I am attempting to do that, attempting to pass on wealth, both spiritually and physically, to my family and to my community. And so this is just one of the ways that we can do that.
Absolutely. And I'm, one of the things that was lingering in the back of my thoughts as throughout this time with you, I was thinking about the spiritual component to your work and to everything that you've shared. That spiritual energy, that spiritual history that maybe we don't explicitly talk about, but is there.
Absolutely.
It's there when you're bringing in the vegetation that has history, like collard greens, or the type of work of engaging with other people. All those are different points of spiritual connections. And so it seems like that's another piece to what your work is about and what you embody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no way that I can go on without pouring libation. Many times with our work on the farm, before we do some planting even, we have to acknowledge the folks that came before. We have to acknowledge the fact that this is stolen land, many times worked on by people like my ancestors that were stolen people. So stolen people work stolen land, and we need to recognize that and acknowledge that, and to do that in both a really literal way, but to do that in a very spiritual way as well. So that when we talk about the land and the landscape, that we create this sense of place. And that's one of the things that's missing from the definition of what placemaking is. You very rarely see when folks define the importance of place, they barely talk about the spiritual connection that we should have to the land and the landscape.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that gave me goosebumps. You saying that. So so important, and needs to be broached in our conversations, especially when we're talking about community engagement and the arts in these capacities. Thank you so much, Seitu. It was such an honor and a privilege to meet you, and to have this conversation with you during our lunch hour. I will remember this and treasure this. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Erie Arts and Culture for making this possible, that we were able to meet and to network on this platform. Please make sure to check out our schedule, the Erie Arts and Culture schedule, and to register for more events this week. There's a phenomenal lineup of phenomenal individuals and artists and collaborations that are happening all over our country that we can learn from together. So register for some more events. I also put in Seitu's link to his website in the chat. And I'm going to also click in there the schedule of events for Erie Arts and Culture for this week that you can follow and register for more virtual sessions. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Big
shout out and thanks to the Erie Arts and Culture.
Awesome. Thank you.